Billionaire takes in a homeless old woman as a maid, but what she reveals about her past changes his life forever. After decades of building an empire and amassing wealth, Renato, a lonely billionaire with no heirs, decides to take in a homeless, elderly woman to care for his empty mansion. To him, she is just another employee, someone to keep the house in order. He treats her with cold indifference. But as days go by, the woman starts sharing stories of her youth, tales of a love she lost, a man who abandoned her, and a child she never got to know. Intrigued, Renato begins to listen, until one detail in her words leaves him breathless. The pieces of the puzzle fall into place in a devastating realization. The woman before him is no stranger. She was the great love of his life, the only one that ever truly mattered, the one he lost due to his own mistakes. And even more shocking, the child she speaks of might be the heir he has spent his whole life searching for. Now, faced with the truth, Renato realizes that all the money in the world cannot buy back lost time. But is there still a chance for forgiveness, for love, and for the family he never knew he had? Renato Alvarez stood at the grand window of his study, gazing out at the manicured lawns of his sprawling estate. The setting sun cast long shadows across the perfectly trimmed hedges and vibrant flower beds, a testament to the meticulous care lavished upon every inch of his domain. Yet, as he surveyed his empire, Renato felt an emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. At 65, he was a man who had everything and nothing. His tech company, Alvarez Tech, was a global leader in artificial intelligence, its stock price soaring to unimaginable heights. His personal fortune was estimated at over $20 billion, a number so large it had long ago lost all meaning. But as he stood there, surrounded by priceless art and antiques, Renato Alvarez was utterly alone. He turned from the window, his reflection in the polished mahogany desk catching his eye. Grey hair, once jet black, was now streaked with silver. Lines etched themselves around his eyes and mouth, marking the passage of time and the weight of his decisions. He was still handsome, in that distinguished way that powerful men often are, but his dark eyes held a weariness that no amount of success could erase. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Come in," he called, his voice crisp and authoritative. His personal assistant, a young man named Thomas, entered the room. "Mr. Alvarez, she's here." Renato nodded, straightening his posture. "Send her in." Thomas disappeared, and moments later an elderly woman shuffled into the study. Renato's eyes widened slightly, taking in her appearance. She was small, almost bird-like, with wispy white hair and weathered skin that spoke of a life lived outdoors. Her clothes were clean but worn, hanging loosely on her thin frame. "Good evening," Renato said, his tone neutral. "I'm Renato Alvarez, and you are?" The woman looked up at him, her blue eyes surprisingly bright and alert. "Maria," she said simply. "Maria Delgado." Renato nodded, gesturing to a chair. "Please, sit down, Mrs. Delgado." "Just Maria, if you don't mind," she replied, lowering herself carefully into the plush leather seat. Renato remained standing, studying her. He had made the decision to hire a live-in housekeeper on a whim, driven by a vague sense that his massive home needed a human touch. When his staff had suggested hiring from a local homeless shelter, he had agreed without much thought. Now, faced with this frail woman, he felt a twinge of uncertainty. "Maria," he began, "I understand you're interested in the position of housekeeper. Have you had experience in this kind of work?" A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Mr. Alvarez, I've been keeping house for longer than you've been alive. I may not look like much, but I know how to make a home shine." There was something in her voice, a quiet dignity that caught Renato off guard. He found himself nodding. "Very well. Thomas will show you to your quarters and go over your duties. You'll start tomorrow." Maria stood slowly, her movements careful but determined. "Thank you, Mr. Alvarez. You won't regret this." As she turned to leave, Renato called out, "Maria?" She paused, looking back at him. "Welcome to the house." She nodded, a flicker of something, gratitude perhaps, crossing her face before she followed Thomas out of the room. Renato watched her go, an odd feeling settling in his chest. He shook it off, returning to his desk, and the mountain of work that awaited him. He had an empire to run, after all. There was no time for sentimentality. The next morning, Renato rose early, as was his habit. He dressed in a tailored suit, every detail perfect, armor for the battlefield of business. As he descended the grand staircase, he was surprised to smell coffee brewing. Following the aroma, he found himself in the kitchen. Maria was there, moving with surprising efficiency as she prepared breakfast. She looked up as he entered, offering a small smile. "Good morning, Mr. Alvarez. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of starting breakfast. How do you like your eggs?" Renato blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. It had been years since anyone had cooked for him in this kitchen. Scrambled is fine," he managed. He watched as Maria bustled about, her movements practiced and sure. Despite her age, there was a grace to her actions, a sense of purpose that seemed to fill the cavernous kitchen with warmth. As she set a plate before him, eggs perfectly scrambled, toast golden brown, a small bowl of fresh fruit on the side, Renato found himself asking, "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Maria's eyes took on a faraway look. "Oh, I've been cooking all my life. My mother taught me, and I taught my—" She trailed off, a shadow passing over her face. Well, that was a long time ago. Renato wanted to press further, curiosity piqued by the unfinished sentence, but years of maintaining emotional distance held him back. Instead, he nodded, turning his attention to the food. As he ate, he couldn't help but notice the way Maria moved about the kitchen, cleaning as she went. There was something familiar about her movements, a ghost of a memory that hovered just out of reach. He shook it off, chalking it up to early morning fuzziness. "This is excellent," he said, surprising himself with the compliment. "Thank you, Maria." She beamed at him, the smile transforming her face. For a moment, Renato caught a glimpse of the young woman she must have been, vibrant and full of life. Then it was gone, replaced by the weathered lines of age. "I'm glad you enjoyed it," she said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a lot of work to do. This house won't clean itself." Renato nodded, watching as she bustled out of the kitchen. He finished his breakfast in silence, the taste somehow richer, more vibrant than he remembered. As he left for work, briefcase in hand, he found himself looking forward to returning home for the first time in years. The days began to take on a new rhythm. Renato would wake to the smell of coffee and a breakfast that varied daily but was always delicious. Maria seemed to have an intuitive understanding of his tastes, preparing meals that he didn't even realize he'd been craving. The house, too, began to change. Rooms that had been cold and sterile took on a lived-in feel. Fresh flowers appeared in vases, their scent filling the air. Curtains were drawn back, letting in sunlight that seemed to chase away the shadows that had lingered for so long. Renato found himself lingering over meals, engaging in small talk with Maria. At first it was awkward, neither of them used to casual conversation, but gradually a comfortable rapport developed between them. One evening, about a week after Maria had arrived, Renato came home later than usual. A major deal had fallen through, leaving him frustrated and on edge. As he entered the house, the smell of something cooking made him pause. Following the aroma, he found Maria in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove. She looked up as he entered, her face creasing with concern. "Rough day?" she asked. Renato nodded, loosening his tie. "You could say that." Maria gestured to the table. "Sit. Dinner will be ready in a moment." Too tired to argue, Renato complied. Minutes later, a steaming bowl was placed in front of him. He looked down, surprised to see a rich, hearty stew. "My mother's recipe," Maria said softly. "She always said it could cure any ailment, even a broken heart." Renato took a spoonful, the flavors exploding on his tongue. It was comfort in a bowl, reminding him of childhood meals long forgotten. As he ate, he felt the tension of the day begin to melt away. "Thank you," he said, looking up at Maria. "This is exactly what I needed." She smiled, patting his hand gently. "Everyone needs a little comfort now and then, Mr. Alvarez, even billionaires." As she turned to leave, Renato found himself saying, "Please call me Renato." Maria paused, looking back at him with surprise. Then she nodded, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Good night, Renato. Sleep well." As he finished his meal, Renato realized that for the first time in years, he felt truly at home in his own house. And as he climbed the stairs to bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in his world. As weeks turned into months, Renato found himself settling into a new routine. The cold, impersonal mansion he had inhabited for so long was slowly transforming into a home. Maria's presence seemed to breathe life into the once sterile rooms, filling them with warmth and the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her wherever she went. One lazy Sunday afternoon, Renato wandered into the library, a room he had rarely used despite its impressive collection. He found Maria there, carefully dusting the leather-bound volumes that lined the shelves. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, offering a gentle smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Renato said, suddenly feeling like an intruder in his own home. Maria shook her head. "Not at all. I was just admiring your collection. You have some real treasures here." Renato's eyes swept across the room, taking in the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves as if seeing them for the first time. "I suppose I do, though I must admit, I've read very few of them." A look of surprise crossed Maria's face. "Really? With all these wonderful stories at your fingertips?" There was no judgment in her tone, only genuine curiosity. Renato found himself shrugging, an oddly vulnerable gesture for a man accustomed to projecting strength and confidence. "I've always been more focused on building my company," he explained. "Reading for pleasure seemed indulgent." Maria's eyes softened. "Oh, Renato," she said, his name still sounding new on her lips. "There's nothing indulgent about nourishing your soul." She reached out, plucking a book from the shelf. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. "Start with this one. It's a personal favorite." Renato took the book, glancing at the title. "To Kill a Mockingbird," he read aloud. "I've heard of it, of course, but you've never read it," Maria finished for him. "Trust me, you're in for a treat." Something in her voice, a mixture of enthusiasm and nostalgia, made Renato curious. "Have you read many of these?" he asked, gesturing to the surrounding shelves. Maria's eyes lit up. "Oh yes, in another life. I used to be quite the bookworm." "Another life?" Renato prompted, intrigued by this glimpse into her past. A shadow crossed Maria's face, a flicker of old pain that was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "That was a long time ago," she said softly. Before everything changed." Renato found himself wanting to press further, to unravel the mystery that seemed to surround this unassuming woman who had come into his life. But the sadness in her eyes held him back. Instead, he nodded, clutching the book she had given him. "Thank you, Maria. I'll give it a try." She smiled, the shadows receding from her gaze. "I hope you enjoy it as much as I did." As Renato turned to leave, a thought struck him. Would you like to join me? For dinner, I mean. We could discuss the book, if you'd like." The words felt foreign on his tongue. When was the last time he had invited someone to simply share a meal and conversation? Maria looked as surprised as he felt, but her face soon softened into a warm smile. "I'd like that very much, Renato. Thank you." That evening, as they sat across from each other at the large dining table, Renato found himself captivated by Maria's passion for literature. She spoke of characters and themes with a depth of understanding that hinted at a life rich with experiences and education. "So you know," Renato said, setting down his fork, "I can't help but wonder about your life before you came here. You seem to have such a wealth of knowledge." Maria's eyes took on that faraway look he had come to recognize. "Oh, I've lived many lives, Renato. Some happy, some less so. Would you tell me about them?" The question slipped out before Renato could stop it, his usual reserve crumbling in the face of genuine curiosity. Maria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. When she spoke, her voice was soft, tinged with a melancholy that tugged at something deep within Renato's chest. "I was young once, you know. Young and full of dreams. I wanted to change the world with words. I studied literature in college, fell in love with the classics. I thought I'd become a teacher, or maybe a writer. She paused, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And then I fell in love, the kind of love you read about in books. He was everything. Handsome, brilliant, with dreams as big as the sky. Renato leaned forward, captivated. What happened? Maria's smile faded, replaced by a look of old pain. Life happened. Dreams collided with reality. He had ambitions that didn't include a quiet life with a would-be writer. He left chasing bigger dreams in the big city. I'm sorry, Renato said, surprised by the depth of emotion in his own voice. Maria shook her head. Don't be. It was a long time ago. And who knows? Maybe it was for the best. After all, life has a way of taking us down unexpected paths. As she spoke, Renato couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. Something in the way she carefully chose her words, in the flicker of emotion that crossed her face when she spoke of her lost love. But he didn't press, sensing that some wounds were still too raw even after all these years. Instead, he found himself sharing stories of his own youth, of the drive that had propelled him from a middle-class background to the pinnacle of success, of the loneliness that had dogged his steps even as his wealth grew, and of the emptiness he had felt standing alone in his massive home, surrounded by all the trappings of success but bereft of true connection. As the evening wore on, Renato realized that for the first time in years, perhaps decades, he was engaged in a genuine conversation. Not a business negotiation, not a superficial exchange at a charity gala, but a real, honest dialogue. And to his surprise, he found himself enjoying it immensely. When they finally bid each other goodnight, Renato felt a strange reluctance to see the evening end. "Thank you, Maria," he said, pausing at the foot of the grand staircase. "This was nice." Maria's smile was warm, touched with a hint of something Renato couldn't quite name. "It was my pleasure, Renato. Sometimes all we need is someone to listen." As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, Renato found himself reflecting on Maria's words. He had spent his life surrounded by people, employees, business partners, socialites, and yet he had never felt truly heard. Until now. That night, as he lay in bed, Renato picked up To Kill a Mockingbird. As he began to read, he found himself drawn into the world of Scout and Atticus Finch, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Renato Alvarez fell asleep with a book on his chest and a smile on his face. The next few weeks saw a subtle shift in the dynamic of the household. Renato found himself lingering over breakfast, engaging Maria in discussions about the books he was reading. Their evening conversations became a regular occurrence, stretching long into the night as they shared stories and perspectives. One evening, as they sat in the library, surrounded by the books that had become a bridge between them, Maria's eyes fell on a framed photograph on Renato's desk. It showed a much younger Renato, his arm around a beautiful young woman with long dark hair and sparkling eyes. "Who is she?" Maria asked softly, her voice tinged with curiosity. Renato's eyes followed her gaze, and a look of old pain crossed his face. "That's Isabella," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She was everything to me once upon a time." Maria leaned forward, her eyes soft with empathy. "What happened?" Renato was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. "I lost her, or rather I drove her away. I was young, ambitious, I thought I could have it all, the successful career, the devoted wife, but I was wrong. I put my work first, always. Late nights at the office, cancelled dates, forgotten anniversaries. I thought I was building a future for us, but I was really just pushing her away." Maria listened intently, her eyes never leaving Renato's face. There was something in her expression, a mix of empathy and recognition, that Renato couldn't quite place. He continued, the words spilling out as if a dam had broken. "By the time I realized what I was losing, it was too late. She told me she was leaving, that she couldn't live in the shadow of my ambition anymore. I begged her to stay, promised I'd change, but But the damage was already done, Maria finished softly. Renato nodded, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. She left, and I threw myself into my work. I told myself it was for the best, that I was meant for greater things than a simple life of love and family. I built my empire, became the man you see today, successful, wealthy, powerful, and alone, Maria added, her voice gentle but firm. Renato met her eyes, surprised by the understanding he saw there. Yes, he admitted, alone. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with unspoken regrets and what-ifs. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice soft but steady. It's never too late, you know. To change, to make amends, to find love again. Renato shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. At my age, with all this baggage? He gestured around the opulent room. Who would want a cynical old billionaire set in his ways? Maria's eyes sparkled with a hint of mischief. You'd be surprised, Renato. Life has a way of offering second chances when we least expect them. Something in her tone made Renato look at her more closely. There was a depth to her gaze, a wisdom that seemed to go beyond her years. For a moment, he felt as if he were looking at a different person entirely, not the frail old woman he had taken in months ago, but someone familiar. The moment passed, and Maria stood, smoothing her apron. It's getting late. We should both get some rest. Renato nodded, still lost in thought. As Maria turned to leave, he called out, "Maria?" She paused at the door, looking back at him. "Yes?" "Thank you," he said softly, "for listening, for understanding." A warm smile spread across her face, transforming her features. "Anytime. Renato, that's what friends are for." As she left, Renato sat back in his chair, his mind whirling. Friends? When was the last time he had considered anyone a friend? And yet, this woman who had entered his life by chance had somehow become more important to him than he could have imagined. He picked up the photograph of Isabella, studying it closely. For the first time in years, the sight of her face didn't bring a stab of pain to his heart. Instead, he felt a gentle warmth, a bittersweet nostalgia for what might have been. As he placed the photo back on his desk, Renato made a decision. It was time to stop living in the past, to stop hiding behind his wealth and power. Maybe Maria was right. Maybe it wasn't too late for second chances. With that thought in mind, he retired to bed feeling lighter than he had in years. As he drifted off to sleep, he found himself looking forward to the future for the first time in a very long time. The next morning, Renato woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He dressed with care, choosing a casual outfit rather than his usual business suit. As he made his way downstairs, he could hear Maria humming softly in the kitchen. He paused in the doorway, watching as she moved about, preparing breakfast with practiced ease. There was something so familiar about her movements, about the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear as she worked. It tugged at his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. "Good morning," he said, stepping into the kitchen. Maria turned, a warm smile lighting up her face. "Good morning, Renato. You're up early." He nodded, taking a seat at the kitchen island. "I was thinking, would you like to go for a walk today? There's a beautiful park not far from here. I haven't visited it in years, but..." Maria's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with pleasure. "I'd love to," she said. "It's been too long since I've enjoyed a nice day outdoors." As they strolled through the park later that morning, Renato found himself seeing the world through new eyes. The vibrant colors of the flowers, the laughter of children playing, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. All things he had overlooked for so long in his single-minded pursuit of success. Maria walked beside him, her pace slow but steady. She pointed out various flowers and birds, sharing tidbits of knowledge that hinted at a deep appreciation for nature. Renato listened, fascinated by this new side of her. They paused to rest, on a bench overlooking a small pond. As they sat in comfortable silence watching ducks glide across the water, Renato felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. "Thank you for suggesting this," Maria said softly. "It's a beautiful day." Renato turned to look at her, struck by the way the sunlight played across her face, softening the lines of age and bringing out a youthful glow in her eyes. For a moment he saw a flash of the young woman she must have been, vibrant, full of life and dreams. "Maria," he said, his voice hesitant, "may I ask you something?" She nodded, her eyes curious. "Last night when we were talking about Isabella, you seemed to understand so well. Have you ever been in love like that?" A shadow passed over Maria's face, a flicker of old pain that was quickly replaced by a wistful smile. "Yes," she said softly. "Once, a long time ago." Renato waited, sensing there was more to the story. After a moment, Maria continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "He was everything to me. Handsome, brilliant, with dreams as big as the sky. We were young, so in love, ready to take on the world together." Her words struck a chord in Renato, echoing his own memories of Isabella. "What happened?" he asked gently. Maria's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep sadness. "Life happened. Dreams collided with reality. He had ambitions that didn't include a quiet life with me. He left, chasing bigger dreams in the big city." As she spoke, something niggled at the back of Renato's mind. There was something familiar about her story, about the way she spoke of her lost love. But before he could grasp it, Maria continued. "I was heartbroken. I thought our love could conquer anything, but I was wrong. After he left, I discovered I was pregnant." Renato's eyes widened in surprise. "You have a child?" Maria's gaze turned distant, filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Had," she corrected softly. "A beautiful baby girl. But I couldn't keep her. I was young, alone, with no means to support a child. I made the hardest decision of my life and gave her up for adoption." Renato felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out, hesitantly placing his hand over Maria's. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She gave him a sad smile, turning her hand to squeeze his gently. "It was a long time ago. I've often wondered what became of her, of the man I loved. But life goes on, doesn't it? We make our choices and we live with them." As they sat there, hand in hand, Renato felt a connection to Maria that went beyond friendship. In her, he saw a kindred spirit, someone who had loved, lost, and carried the weight of their decisions through the years. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said softly. "I know it must not be easy to talk about." Maria nodded, her eyes refocusing on the present. "It's strange," she mused. "I haven't spoken about that part of my life in years, but somehow, with you it feels right." They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Renato stood, offering his hand to Maria. "Shall we head back?" he asked. She took his hand, allowing him to help her up. As they walked back towards the mansion, Renato felt a shift in the air between them. Something had changed, a deeper understanding forged through shared pain and mutual compassion. That night, as he lay in bed, Renato found himself thinking about Maria's story. There was something about it that tugged at his memory, a sense of familiarity he couldn't shake. But exhaustion soon overtook him, and he drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with echoes of the past and whispers of a future yet to unfold. The days that followed their walk in the park took on a new rhythm. Renato found himself spending more time at home, his usual drive to work every waking hour diminished by a growing desire to uncover more about Maria's past, and perhaps to understand his own heart better in the process. One afternoon, as Maria dusted the mantelpiece in the living room, Renato noticed her pausing before a small ornate clock. Her fingers traced its intricate design, a look of recognition flashing across her face. "Do you like it?" Renato asked, startling her from her reverie. Maria turned, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It reminds me of one I had a long time ago." Renato moved closer, studying the clock. "It was a gift," he explained, "from an old friend years ago. I never knew much about its history. Maria's eyes widened slightly. An old friend? Renato nodded, a wistful smile playing at his lips. Carlos Mendoza. We were roommates in college before I became who I am today. He gave me this clock as a graduation gift, said it was a family heirloom meant to be passed down to someone special. As he spoke, Renato noticed Maria's hands beginning to tremble. She gripped the duster tightly, her knuckles turning white. "Maria," he asked, concern coloring his voice. "Are you all right?" She nodded quickly, too quickly. Yes, I'm fine, just a bit tired, I suppose, if you'll excuse me." Before Renato could say another word, Maria hurried from the room, leaving him puzzled and slightly worried. He couldn't shake the feeling that something about the clock, or perhaps the mention of Carlos, had deeply affected her. That evening, Maria didn't join Renato for their usual dinner conversation. Thomas informed him that she had retired early, claiming a headache. Renato ate alone, his thoughts churning with questions and half-formed suspicions. The next morning, Renato woke early, determined to speak with Maria. But as he descended the stairs, he was met by a flustered-looking Thomas. "Mr. Alvarez," Thomas said, his voice tight with concern. "Maria's gone." "Gone?" Renato repeated, disbelief coloring his tone. "What do you mean, gone?" Thomas handed him a folded piece of paper. "She left this for you, sir, and she took nothing with her, not even the few possessions she came with." Renato unfolded the note with trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. Maria's neat flowing script filled the page. "Dear Renato, I'm sorry to leave like this, without a proper goodbye. You've shown me more kindness in these past months than I've known in years, and for that I will always be grateful. But I fear I've allowed myself to become too comfortable, too close. There are truths in my past that I'm not ready to face, memories that are better left undisturbed. Please don't try to find me. Know that I leave with a heavy heart, but also with the knowledge that this is for the best. Take care of yourself, Renato, and remember, it's never too late for second chances. Yours always, Maria." Renato read the note once, twice, 3 times, his mind struggling to comprehend Maria's sudden departure. How could she just leave after everything they'd shared? And what truths was she running from? As the initial shock wore off, determination set in. Renato Alvarez was not a man accustomed to accepting defeat, in business or in life. He would not let Maria disappear without answers, without at least trying to understand. "Thomas," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Cancel my meetings for the week, and get me everything you can find on Maria Delgado's background." Thomas nodded, hurrying off to comply with his employer's orders. Renato returned to his study, the note clutched tightly in his hand. As he sat at his desk, his eyes fell on the ornate clock that had seemed to trigger Maria's distress. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. For the first time, he noticed an inscription on the base, faded with age. "To my beloved Isabella, may our love be as eternal as time. Forever yours, Carlos." Renato's breath caught in his throat. Isabella. Carlos. The pieces began to fall into place, a picture forming that he could scarcely believe. Could it be possible? Could Maria be? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He needed facts, not wild speculation. But as he set the clock down, Renato couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering a truth that would change everything. The next few days passed in a blur of research and revelation. Renato threw himself into the task of uncovering Maria's past with the same intensity he had once applied to building his business empire. He hired private investigators, combed through old records, and called in favors from contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. Bit by bit, a story began to emerge. Maria Delgado, born Maria Vasquez, had indeed been a promising literature student at the same university Renato had attended. She had been involved with a young man named Carlos Mendoza, Renato's old roommate and friend. The more Renato discovered, the more his heart ached. Maria had become pregnant in her final year of college, but by then Carlos had already left, chasing his dreams in the big city. Alone and afraid, Maria had made the heartbreaking decision to give up her child for adoption. As Renato pieced together the timeline, a devastating realization dawned on him. The child Maria had given up would be about his age now. And Carlos? Carlos had been his roommate, his friend, the man who had given him the clock, a family heirloom meant for someone special. Could it be possible? Was he? Renato's hands shook as he picked up the phone, dialing a number he knew by heart, but hadn't called in years. "Carlos?" he said when the line connected. "It's Renato, we need to talk." Hours later, Renato sat in his study, a tumbler of scotch untouched before him. His conversation with Carlos had confirmed his suspicions and revealed even more painful truths. Carlos had known. He had discovered Maria's pregnancy after he left, had even tried to find the child years later. When he reconnected with Renato in college and realized the truth, he had been too ashamed, too cowardly to reveal it. The clock had been his way of passing on a piece of family history, a silent acknowledgement of a connection Renato had never known existed. As the full weight of the revelation settled over him, Renato felt a maelstrom of emotions: anger, grief, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of loss. He had spent his entire life searching for meaning, for connection, only to discover that what he sought had been within reach all along. Maria, his mother, had been under his roof for months. She had cooked for him, cared for him, shared stories and laughter. And he had never known, never even suspected the truth of their connection. Now she was gone, running from a past that had suddenly caught up with her, and Renato was left to grapple with a truth that shook the very foundations of his identity. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the study, Renato made a decision. He would find Maria. He would bring her home. And together, they would face the truth that had been hidden for so long. With renewed determination, Renato began to formulate a plan. He would use every resource at his disposal, every connection he had made over his years in business. He would search every corner of the country if he had to, because now, for the first time in his life, Renato Alvarez had something worth more than all his wealth and success combined, a chance at the family he never knew he had. As he set his empty glass down and stood to face the new day, Renato felt a mix of fear and hope, unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The billionaire who had once prided himself on his emotional detachment now found his heart racing, with a potent cocktail of anticipation and dread. Renato's first step was to assemble a team of the best private investigators money could buy. He provided them with all the information he had gathered about Maria's past, along with a generous budget and strict instructions to be discreet. The last thing he wanted was for Maria to be frightened away by overzealous searchers. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Renato threw himself into the search with a fervor that surprised even his closest associates. He neglected his business affairs, delegating more and more responsibilities to his trusted executives. For the first time in decades, Alvarez Tech was not his top priority. As the search dragged on, Renato found himself spending more time in the rooms Maria had once tended. He would sit in the kitchen, remembering their shared meals and conversations. He'd wander the library, running his fingers along the spines of books they had discussed. Every corner of the mansion seemed to hold a memory, a whisper of the connection he had failed to recognize. One evening, as he sat in his study, staring at the ornate clock that had sparked this journey, Renato's phone rang. It was the lead investigator. "Mr. Alvarez," the man said, his voice tense with excitement. "We've found her." Renato's heart leapt into his throat. "Where?" "A small town in New Mexico. She's been staying at a women's shelter there for the past few months." Renato was on his feet in an instant, already mentally preparing for the journey. "Send me the details. I'm leaving immediately." Hours later, Renato found himself standing outside a nondescript building in a dusty New Mexico town. His usual polished appearance was rumpled from the hasty journey, his heart pounding with nervous energy. As he raised his hand to knock on the door, doubts assailed him. What if Maria didn't want to see him? What if she rejected him, the son she had given up so many years ago? What if this reunion only brought more pain to both of them? But beneath the doubts, a deeper certainty propelled him forward. This was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to know the truth, to understand the woman who had given him life, and to forge the connection he had been missing his entire life. Taking a deep breath, Renato knocked. Moments later, the door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, taking in Renato's disheveled appearance with a mix of curiosity and concern. "I'm looking for Maria Delgado," Renato said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Please, it's important that I speak with her." The woman's expression softened with understanding. "You must be Renato," she said gently. "Maria told us you might come looking for her." Renato's heart skipped a beat. "She did? Is she here?" The woman nodded, stepping aside. "Come in, I'll take you to her." As Renato followed the woman through the shelter's hallways, his mind raced. What would he say? How could he possibly express everything he was feeling? They stopped outside a small room. The woman knocked softly. "Maria, there's someone here. To see you." There was a moment of silence, then a familiar voice, a voice that now held so much more meaning, replied, "Come in." The woman opened the door, gesturing for Renato to enter. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. Maria sat in a chair by the window, her face turned toward the fading sunlight. As Renato entered, she slowly turned to face him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the questions, all the pain, all the years of separation seemed to crystallize into a single point of connection. "Hello, Renato," Maria said softly, her voice trembling slightly. Renato felt tears pricking at his eyes. "Hello." "Mom," he replied, the word feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, drinking, burned the sight of one another with new understanding. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, they moved toward each other. Renato knelt before Maria's chair, taking her weathered hands in his. "I'm sorry," he began, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you, to understand." Maria's eyes brimmed with tears. "Oh, my boy," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. "My beautiful boy, I'm the one who should be sorry. I never meant to leave you, to keep the truth from you for so long." As the tears began to fall, Renato did something he hadn't done since he was a small child. He laid his head in his mother's lap and wept. Maria stroked his hair, her own tears falling silently as years of pent-up emotion poured out of both of them. When the storm of emotion finally subsided, Renato looked up at Maria, his eyes red but clear. "Will you come home?" he asked softly. "Will you give us a chance to be the family we never had?" Maria hesitated, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions. "Renato, I'm not sure I deserve that chance. I've made so many mistakes." Renato shook his head firmly. "We've both made mistakes, but we have a chance now to make things right. Please, Mom, come home with me." For a long moment, Maria was silent, her eyes searching Renato's face. Then, slowly, a smile began to spread. Across her features, a smile of hope, of love, of new beginnings. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I'll come home." As they left the shelter together, Renato's arm supporting Maria, both felt the weight of the past lifting. The road ahead would not be easy. There were years of separation to overcome, wounds to heal, truths to face. But they would face it together, mother and son, finally reunited. As they drove back to the airport, the New Mexico sunset painting, the sky in brilliant hues, Renato glanced at Maria. She was gazing out the window, a look of peaceful contentment on her face. In that moment, he knew that all his wealth, all his success paled in comparison to the treasure he had found in this remarkable woman. The mansion that had once felt so empty and cold would soon be filled with warmth and life. There would be long conversations by the fireplace, shared meals in the kitchen, and new memories to be made in every room. And perhaps, Renato thought with a smile, it was time to finally read all those books in the library, with his mother by his side to discuss them. As they boarded the private jet that would take them home, Renato felt a sense of completeness he had never known before. The journey that had begun with a homeless woman at his door had led him to the most precious discovery of his life. The plane took off, carrying them towards their new beginning. And as the lights of the small New Mexico town faded behind them, Renato knew that the true meaning of wealth had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love, family, and second chances. The weeks following Maria's return to the mansion were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments for both mother and son. Renato, accustomed to his solitary lifestyle, found himself navigating the unfamiliar territory of sharing his space and his life with someone who was, in many ways, both intimately familiar and a complete stranger. Maria, for her part, struggled with the opulence of her new surroundings. The woman who had spent years on the streets now found herself living in a palatial home, surrounded by luxuries she had never dreamed of. It was a stark contrast to the life she had known, and at times it overwhelmed her. One morning, about a month after their return, Renato found Maria in the kitchen, furiously scrubbing at an already spotless counter. "Mom," he said softly, the word still new and wonderful on his tongue. "What are you doing?" Maria looked up, her eyes wide and a little frantic. I need to earn my keep. I can't just sit around all day while you work." Renato's heart clenched at the fear and insecurity he saw in his mother's eyes. Gently, he took the sponge from her hands and led her to sit at the kitchen island. "You don't need to earn your keep," he said firmly. "This is your home now. You're my mother, not my housekeeper." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to be anything else anymore, Renato. I've spent so long just trying to survive. I don't know how to live this life." Renato took her weathered hands in his, marveling at how small and fragile they felt. "Then we'll learn together," he said softly. "We have a lifetime of catching up to do. Let's start by just being." From that day on, Renato made a conscious effort to include Maria in every aspect of his life. He took time off work, delegating more responsibilities to his trusted executives. Instead, he spent his days with Maria, slowly unraveling the threads of their shared past and weaving a new future together. They spent long hours in the library, Maria introducing Renato to her favorite classics, and Renato sharing the business books that had shaped his career. They cooked together in the kitchen, Maria teaching Renato family recipes passed down through generations, while he introduced her to exotic cuisines from his world travels. As the days passed, the mansion began to transform. Rooms that had once been sterile and impersonal took on new life. Maria's touch was everywhere, fresh flowers on every table, hand-knit throws draped over chairs, and the constant aroma of home-cooked meals wafting through the halls. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching the sunset, Maria turned to Renato with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said softly, "I've been thinking about all the children out there who are like you were, alone, without a family. I wonder if there's something we could do to help them." Renato felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was the mother he had always dreamed of, kind, compassionate, always thinking of others. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. Maria's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Well, you have all these resources at your disposal. What if we started a foundation, something to help foster children or support adoption services?" Renato nodded slowly, ideas already forming in his mind. "We could do more than that," he said. "We could create a whole network of support, education programs, job training, mentorship opportunities." As they talked late into the night, their excitement growing with each new idea, Renato realized that this shared purpose, this chance to make a difference, was the missing piece he had been searching for his entire life. The next day, Renato called an emergency board meeting at Alvarez Tech. As he stood before his executives, Maria by his side, he felt a sense of purpose, unlike anything he had experienced in years. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong and clear, "I'm here to announce a new direction for our company. While we will continue our work in technology and innovation, we will also be launching a major new initiative, the Alvarez Family Foundation." He went on to outline their plans, a comprehensive program to support underprivileged children and families, leveraging Alvarez Tech's resources and connections to create real, lasting change. As he spoke, Renato could see the surprise and confusion on some faces. This was a far cry from the ruthless businessman they had known for so long. But as he continued, passion infusing every word, he saw that surprise turn to understanding. and then to enthusiasm. By the end of the meeting, the board had unanimously approved the new initiative. As the executives filed out, many stopped to shake Maria's hand, welcoming her to the Alvarez tech family. In the months that followed, Renato and Maria threw themselves into their new project with unbridled enthusiasm. The Alvarez Family Foundation quickly became one of the most influential charitable organizations in the country. Its innovative programs and hands-on approach garnering attention and praise from all quarters. Renato found himself energized in a way he hadn't been in years. The challenge of building something meaningful, something that could change lives, reignited the passion that had driven him in his early days of business. Maria, too, blossomed in her new role. Her natural warmth and empathy made her a favorite with the children and families they worked with. She had a gift for connecting with people, for making them feel heard and valued. One day, as they were visiting one of the foundation's new community centers, a young boy tugged on Maria's sleeve. "Are you really his mom?" he asked, pointing at Renato. Maria knelt down to the boy's level, her eyes twinkling. "I am," she said softly, "but I didn't always know it. We found each other later in life." The boy's eyes widened. "So, it's never too late to find your family?" Maria glanced up at Renato, a world of understanding passing between them. "No, sweetheart," she said, turning back to the boy. "It's never too late." As they drove home that evening, Renato found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter with a homeless woman, to the discovery of a long-lost family connection, to the creation of a foundation that was changing lives, it all seemed like a dream. "Penny for your thoughts?" Maria asked, noticing his pensive expression. Renato smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am," he said softly. "For so long I thought success was about money and power, but now I know. True success is about love, family, and making a difference in the world." Maria's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We're both lucky," she said. "We've been given a second chance and we're making the most of it." As they pulled up to the mansion, no longer just a house but truly a home, Renato felt a sense of peace wash over him. The emptiness that had plagued him for so long was gone, replaced by a fullness of heart he had never thought possible. That night, as they sat in the library sharing a pot of tea and discussing plans for the foundation's next project, Renato looked at his mother, this strong, compassionate woman who had come into his life so unexpectedly, and felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. Maria looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," Renato replied. "For giving me life, for finding your way back to me, for showing me what really matters." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Oh, my boy," she said, reaching out to cup his cheek. "Thank you for giving me a reason to live again, for showing me that it's never too late for a new beginning." As they sat there, mother and son, surrounded by books and memories, both old and new, Renato knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for his entire life. Not in wealth or success, but in the simple, profound connection of family. The mansion, once cold and empty, now buzzed with life and purpose. The Alvarez Family Foundation continued to grow and thrive, touching countless lives. And at the heart of it all were Renato and Maria, two souls who had found each other against all odds, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we least expect to find. As the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, Renato raised his teacup in a silent toast. To second chances, to new beginnings, to the incredible journey of life and love. And as Maria raised her cup to meet his, their eyes meeting over the rim, both knew that this was just the beginning of their story. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt, but together they could face anything, for in each other they had found not just family, but home,